In this episode of Health Wells, we are visiting Bionano Genomics to learn about how their flagship Saphyr optical genome mapping system is revolutionizing next-generation cytogenomics. We will briefly be looking at what optical genome mapping is, why it really matters. We'll look at the financials from the last quarterly result, but most importantly, we're going to take a look at the regulatory environment because one of my viewers asked me the question about pending FDA approval, if we can expect it anytime soon, and what my thoughts are. So, if any of these covered topics interest you, stick around until the end to learn more about it. As you might expect, the 2020 annual report provides a succinct summary of what Bionano Genomics do. They are a global leader in optical genome mapping, which is a solution for genome analysis. They provide tools and services primarily based around the Saphyr system to scientists and clinicians conducting genetic research and patient testing. They also have a testing service for pediatric patients suspected of neurodevelopmental disabilities through their wholly owned subsidiary Lineargen. The Saphyr system is a platform for ultra-sensitive and ultra-specific structural variation detection that enables researchers and clinicians to accelerate the research and the search for new diagnostics and therapeutic targets to streamline the identification of structural changes in chromosomes known as cytogenetics. Specifically, optical genome mapping is a method of genome analysis that reveals structural variations in the genome. A structural variations refers to a large-scale structural difference in the genomic DNA of one individual compared to another. Structural variations, of course, can vary dramatically in size and can involve the rearrangement or repetition of a few several hundred base pairs to as many as tens of million base pairs. So you may be wondering, why does the search into structural variations matter? Well, you might suspect correctly, structural variations are known to cause disease such as genetic disorders, cancers and others, and they can either appear spontaneously or can be the result of inheritance. To illustrate this point again, let's make use of the Health Wealth logo. If the task is to identify potential genetic disease by identifying a particular subset of pixels that do not show the correct color or intensity as expected, and we assume that that is the indication of a particular disease, well, then we need to look much closer at this logo and the resolution. So if we zoom in as the HealthWealth logo is displayed on a large television, you can of course identify the individual pixels on the TV that make up the entire image. And at this resolution, of course, the task of identifying or seeing any particular pixel that may not display the right color is much easier than in the previous view. However, when we look at this magnification and so far zoomed in, you can rightfully say, well, we kind of tend to lose the big picture. And by looking at this in-depth resolution at the individual pixels, we in fact really have lost sight of the big picture, as I'm about to show you and demonstrate to you. Because only when we started to zoom back out again, we have been looking precisely at this area right here. You notice that, in fact, there is a shift in a large portion of the Health Wealth logo. Equate this to the genome, and this could be said to be the equivalence of a structural variation. While we were in fact looking very closely at this area here to discern if there were any pixels not showing the right color, we have not been able to see or even realize that in fact an entire frame was shifted significantly to the left. This is the example that I'm trying to make in order to explain the effect of a structural variation in the genome. And this is precisely how the Saphyr system and optical genome mapping is different, or we are imaging the genome at a vastly different scale compared to the short read sequencers that you may be familiar more from companies like Illumina. or Pacific Biosciences. So then let's take a real quick look at the third quarter 21 financial results of Bionano Genomics. So what we're seeing here from the data presented is that we see the beginning of a transition from Bionano Genomics, namely from that of a pure, well, hardware-based company with the Saphyr system and the associated consumables to a structural variation company with a data solutions provider. Now, this, of course, we see in many other areas as well. The true value, of course, is always in the data. So this is why Bionano Genomics are very well positioned now with the acquisition of BioDiscovery. During Q3, Bionano Genomics have expanded the install base of their Saphyr system from previously 121 at the end of Q2 to 141 systems at the end of Q3. So this is definitely some fantastic growth, which of course is associated and followed up with the consumables, which of course then also are expected to rise in terms of the number of sales. And due to its performance, optical genome mapping enabled with the Saphyr system was adapted into several cytogenetics labs across the US. All this, of course, also trickles down into the financial bottom line. So we see here that the total revenue for the third quarter was 4.7 million, which is a 21% increase from the second quarter of this year and a 112% increase from the same period in the year previously. Then the gross margin had slightly decreased to 24% in comparison to 37% in the previous quarter, and this mainly related to increases in lab expenses, warranty-related expenses, which are expected to be non-recurring. So what's the financial overall situation in terms of cash at hand? Bionano Genomics report having $326 million at hand, and this is substantially more than they had 38 million at the end of the 2020 calendar year. Of course, that increase is the direct result primarily due to the equity raises which were done during the first quarter of 2021. Now, in order to start answering the question from one of my viewers related to FDA approval of the Saphyr system and if that might happen next year, I find it useful to dig a little bit deeper and into the past as well. So what I'm showing here is the S1 statement which Bionano Genomics filed on June 28 in 2018. Now, of course, this is now several years old, but nevertheless, I find the wording in this document of particular interest. So, in case you are not familiar with the terminology or you are unaware, the Saphyr system is still currently being sold in the United States as a research use only or RUO type of product. And in the S1 statement, we see clearly written here that initially Bionano Genomics are focusing on the life sciences research market. So this is of key importance to me. This includes, of course, labs associated with academic as well as governmental research. Okay, that's ultimately no surprise. The FDA clearly distinguishes and views very differently systems such as the Saphyr system sold towards research-related applications in comparison to using those for commercial applications and clinical use. So as stated here, and this is absolutely correct, if the FDA were to determine that our products are intended for clinical use, or if Bionano Genomics decided to market the Saphyr system for a clinical use, they would obviously be required to obtain the FDA 510(k) clearance or a pre-market approval in order to be able to sell the product in the US with the FDA laws and regulations respected. Optical genome mapping ultimately is an in vitro diagnostic, and the FDA can regulate in vitro diagnostics also as medical devices, which ultimately means that an in vitro diagnostic test, such as optical genome mapping, may be equally susceptible to requiring 510(k) or the pre-market approval process in order to start marketing commercially such an in vitro diagnostic test. One subset of in vitro diagnostics are the so-called laboratory developed tests, or LTDs. And this category is reserved to tests that are designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory. If we skim the S1 a little bit further, here is the key phrase I'd like to point out to you, and the choice of wording is quite important in my opinion. Because here they wrote, if in the future we choose to commercialize our products for clinical diagnostic use. So this would require obviously 510(k) clearance or pre-market approval. And I point out they say if, not when. So of course, the S1 was filed many years ago in 2018, as I had pointed out. Of course, management's decision can evolve over time, but nevertheless, they started out basically not under the assumption that they will go for clinical diagnostic use. This is here listed as an if, not a when statement. So when we then go back to the 2020 annual report, we see here that optical genome mapping is listed, or the Saphyr system is ultimately still listed here. Our products are currently intended for research use only, or RU applications. And they furthermore state, of course, that many of the customers may use our products to develop their own products, and those are ultimately the lab-developed tests, which could be subject to regulation by the FDA. While being research use only, of course, many of the FDA requirements, such as 510(k) or pre-market approval, do not apply. And so you may already know obtaining 510(k) clearance or pre-market approval are not necessarily very easy steps. In fact, it is easier to obtain 510(k) clearance because here a predicate device already exists in the market, and through the provision of data demonstrating equivalence to that device, the 510(k) clearance can be obtained more easily. The pre-market approval pathway ultimately applies to those devices that cannot be cleared through the 510(k) process. Not surprisingly, definitely more complex, costly, and also lengthy than the 510(k), because the applicant would have to provide extensive data that is involving the technical, preclinical, clinical trials, manufacturing related procedures, processes, in order to satisfy and demonstrate to the FDA the safety and effectiveness of the device according to its intended use. As many of the research labs using the Saphyr system ultimately are developing their own lab-developed tests, they would, in theory, be subject to the scrutiny of the FDA. However, the FDA has the statutory authority to regulate medical devices, which include potentially lab-developed tests, but historically the FDA have exercised enforcement discretion and not enforced applicable provisions of the FDA Act to regulating lab-developed tests. I much more have the impression that Bionano Genomics for now will stay in the research use only phase, ultimately performing or following a gold rush pick and shovel play, whereby the research use only Saphyr system is feeding into the various labs that use the system in order to develop their own clinical research or use this to develop lab-developed tests in order to help ultimately the validation of the Saphyr system for many different types of indications. However, in parallel, they also have the LinearGen subsidiary, which is providing diagnostic services, as clearly shown here. One thing that is of particular interest here is that these LinearGen subsidiary is using chromosomal microarray analysis types of tests that are used to identify suspected genetic disease. And here is the interesting part. We are actively performing research to determine whether optical genome mapping with the Saphyr system, of course, with the Saphyr system can replace the chromosomal microarray analysis as a frontline test for children with developmental disorders. Again, using here scientific peer-reviewed literature to support this, etc. So this is again one of the ways of how the Saphyr system is used in parallel alongside the clinical, validated current gold standards in order to obtain ultimately for Bionano Genomics a vast set of clinical evidences that in fact optical genome mapping is at least equivalent, but hopefully oftentimes much cheaper, much faster than the gold standard with the same rigor of analysis and results shown. The market opportunity for optical genome mapping is huge. According to the Research and Markets, the worldwide market for genetics products and services is estimated to be roughly 54.4 billion by the year 2025. And obviously, Bionano Genomics are doing their best to take a percentage of that global market. However, the challenge that the company is facing is that it is not just a single or a simple 510K clearance for the Saphyr system as such. The Saphyr system is just one element of the so-called in vitro diagnostic, which ultimately optical genome mapping represents. And this is always in connection to a particular type of assay or structural variation for a particular disease to be identified. So in fact, there is not a one-size-fits-all 510K or pre-market approval that would bring the system out of the research use only into the commercial clinical realm. And we have evidences to support this also from Illumina, who have obtained their 510K clearance for one of their systems, again for a particular type of test, and not just an outright clearance for their system for any type of genetic sequencing. So here, in fact, I do have the 510K clearance document open for the Illumina system for the specific CFTR, cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator gene from human peripheral whole blood specimens. So this is applies to the Illumina MySec DX system, and as you can see, for a very particular type of variant assay. So again, this 510K clearance does not mean that this Illumina device is cleared for any type of genetic analysis. It is in conjunction with an assay for a very particular type of test. And so the question, if we make that translation to Bionano Genomics, cannot be answered that easily. When will the Saphyr system receive 510K clearance? Well, it could certainly, but always for a particular test. And here, as I have shown, the LinearGen subsidiary can definitely help in this regard. And I'm very certain that precisely this type of work is done in order to eventually validate a particular test to be run on the Saphyr system and obtain then either 510K clearance or a pre-market approval. But we cannot make an outright statement when the Saphyr system will be cleared, period, because it is always tied to a particular type of test to be run on the system. So in conclusion, Bionano Genomics are doing a lot of work in order to roll out the Saphyr system into more labs and create revenue in that regard. I do not see any evidences of trying to obtain a 510K or PMA clearance for a commercial application anytime soon, although certainly this could be the case for particular tests. But as I have said and tried to explain previously, not a single 510K will make the Saphyr system commercially available for just any test. It is always as an in vitro diagnostic. The Saphyr system enables a particular type of test, and the combination, a particular test run on the system would then be subject to receiving 510(k) or PMA approval, and it would only be for that indication. I hope you found the information presented useful and you learned some valuable information about Bionano Genomics and the regulatory environment. If you like this kind of content and enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to my channel.